Hello, everybody. Welcome to ELT 106 American Literature. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the 60s and 70s. It's going to start a little bit in the 50s to kind of give you some feelings about why these things happen. I'm sorry I had to go to, got to go. Anyway, I'm in Adana, of all places, at Chukurova University, giving a presentation. So I'm going to miss you guys, and I know you guys are going to miss me a lot. But it'll be okay. We'll be okay. It's going to be okay. All right, here we go. The 1950s. Okay, last week we talked about the 40s and 50s, and a lot of what we talked about was World War II. Okay. The war was fun for a while, but when we got bored of having the war, we threw some bombs at Japan, and, boom, boom, and then they said, okay, that's enough. Okay, and so then they wanted to take their army and go home. And and then also, at the same time, we had done this big invasion of Europe in 1944, and we were doing really successful on the ground in Europe. Things were going good for the Americans, bad for the Germans, bad for the Japanese. 1945, Germany and Japan called it quits. However, what had happened is Russia had started fighting against Germany too in Eastern Europe, and the Russians were pushing towards Berlin. But the Americans were not at war with the Russians. The Americans were at war with the Germans and the Japanese. And so when the Americans came up against the Russians, they were thinking, should we attack the Russians? And a lot of people thought, yeah, because it was pretty obvious that the Russians were trying to take over these countries, which was really what the war was about. We didn't want Germany to take over all the countries. And so they, but America didn't want any more war. It had been hard. A lot of Americans had died. The American people were not able to really enjoy their lives because they were all focusing on the war, and they were really starting to get tired of it. And you started to hear this anti-war stuff, and all these things. And so they stopped fighting, and the Americans went home. The Russians, however, did not go home. They stayed there. They occupied Eastern Europe. They kept half of Berlin, built a wall. And the Americans didn't like this, but the Americans were trying to get the Russians to do things through diplomacy, which didn't work very well. And so there got to be this conflict between communism and capitalism. And communism started to be a really bad thing. The Americans had this government group that was called the House Un-American Activities Committee. It was actually started in 1938, but throughout the war it didn't really do much. But after the war, it started really looking into the communists. There were about 500,000 communists in America, which is a very small percentage of the population, really. But they got really worried about these people. And a lot of this anti-communist stuff was led by Senator Joe McCarthy. And he became the face of anti-communism. And then there was these issues, they called it McCarthyism, these anti-communist rhetoric, and um, finding people who were communists and putting them in jail and all this kind of stuff. They called this the Red Scare. They found some Soviet spies in America, which is kind of normal. I mean, countries have spies places. But they really freaked out over this. Oh my God, there's spies, they're everywhere. They went into Hollywood and the film industry, and they thought, oh, there's so many communists in there. And they were, but I mean, they were just like, these were not like terrorists. They were just people who thought that a different kind of society would be better. That's all. But they started to really persecute these guys, and they had to renounce communism, and they moved out. They lose their jobs, so people became very scared about talking about things. And it's like if you said to someone, yeah, you're a communist, that person could potentially come under investigation and lose their job and all this stuff just because someone said you're a communist. I mean, people were really kind of freaked out about communism. The Korean War was about communism. The Chinese, the Russians supported the North, so the Americans went in and supported the South. The Vietnam War was the same thing. These were not really wars because Congress didn't declare these wars, but the presidents of America sent the military in to do this stuff. And so what you had is this really like ultra-conservative society, because it was really important to be American and to be seen as American. And this meant white male American. This is what America was. And you couldn't say anything you couldn't criticize the government. So you had to support the government. You had to be saying, oh yes, America's the greatest place. You had to be Christian, and you had to have an American flag on your house and all this stuff. And there was a lot of stuff in the media, the Red Menace, the Red Iceberg, all this stuff about red, which is communism. And so the commies were really the enemy, and the media. Okay, so this is still the 1950s. You can see this is like this typical 1950s family, and you can see how happy Dad is, and Mom just does nothing but stays home and bakes cakes all day. And look at the little kids, they're so blonde and happy. And it wasn't real life. So the realities of life were not really being shown. Any pain, any suffering. And then, people weren't happy. You had domestic violence at home, people beating up their wives and their kids and all this stuff, and pretending to be these happy, lovely families. You can see this picture down here of race mixing is communism. So that's really strange. Like, this concept of separate but equal is the blacks and the whites being separate, but but legal under the law. But really, they were not equal. They were not equal. And they, in a lot of ways, they still aren't equal. So, anyway, this is the 1950s with the happy family. Mom bakes the cake, the kids are there. But the reality is there was a lot of anger. There was a lot of social stress that was kind of going on underneath the surface. Now, in the economy at the time, people had money. They started making babies. You had a house, you had a car, you had a job. Things were looking good. Yeah, why not have some kids? So they had what they called the baby boom. And you can see this. This is 1960. And this is the age of the American population. And you can see how many of these people are babies. And right around here, it's like 25. Like everyone is younger than 25. Remember, a lot of the people who would have been like 35, 40, 45 died in the war. Millions of people died in the war. And so the population was a very, very young population. And about in the 60s, you started to get these 15, 20-year-olds, these teenagers and young 20s, people about your age. And they kind of controlled society. And they said, no, we're not going to be like you. I don't want to be this guy who just goes to work and never asks any questions and never thinks about anything. And I want to be free and I want to be different. And what was really cool in 1955 was really uncool in 1965. Going to university, having a good job, and looking like these kind of things. They were like, oh, that is so boring. So, you started getting these hippies doing this stuff, and people were taking drugs. Now, there had always been drugs, but they weren't really popular. Now it started becoming really popular. And people started sharing drugs and doing drugs together. And they started saying, make love, not war. Tune in, turn on, and drop out. Tune into the music, tune into the movement, turn on to drugs, and then drop out of school. So they were kind of saying, join the movement, take drugs, drop out of school. And this hell no, we won't go. It was an anti-war slogan. And then people started saying, yeah, black is beautiful, and this anti-racist stuff. So let me talk a little bit about this racism that was happening in the 60s. Racism started getting a bit violent. It was, for a long time, the blacks had been, we talked about separate but equal, but it really wasn't equal. And the blacks really didn't like that. But they didn't have very much power. But what happened in the 60s is people started really supporting them. I started really saying, yeah, this isn't right. And so they started to get more emboldened, and they actually started to get militaristic. So there was this Black Panther Party. And what the Black Panther Party was about is in the black communities, they would protect the black people from the white police who were violent. And They also wanted to improve the schools for the children, make sure that the children had food to eat when they went to school. And, and they were pretty visible and vocal group. And then here is Detroit, and like this is the area that I grew up in, Detroit. Later I moved to San Francisco, but I kind of grew up in Detroit. And so you can see what's happening here. In July of 1967, some black soldiers came back from the war in Vietnam. And their family and friends were really happy to see them. They started throwing a party for them. And they, the party got a little out of hand. People were drinking. Stuff was going on. They were making some noise. Some people complained. And the police came. And the police, of course, were white. And they were saying, you guys got to shut it down. You guys got to go home. They were saying, come on, man. Our friends are back from the military, and we just want to welcome them, and you don't got to be like such a big jerk. But the police instead started saying, okay, well, we're going to start beating people up and throwing people in jail. And then the people started fighting the police. And then this was happening in the street. And then the other black people saw it, and they came out, and there were a whole lot of black people and a few white police. So the white police called in more police came, more black people came, and it led to 3 days of riots. And it was insane rioting. They were burning buildings, they were looting, people were shooting each other. It was a really, there had been a lot of tension between the whites and the blacks, and it just came out at this point. What was happening is that some of the America in the 1950s had all this power because they had all these factories. At Europe and Asia didn't have factories. Well, they started building factories in Europe and Asia, not needing American stuff. So they started to fire American workers, and they always fired the black people first. So it was really frustrating for the black people. And what was happening is that there were more black people there, and as the black people there, the white people were saying, well, I'm going to leave. I don't want to be near the black people. So there really started to be a black community. And eventually, you can see from this picture, they called in the military. And, you had tanks rolling down Michigan Avenue. Just a mess. It was just bad. It was just bad. A lot of really, really serious racial tensions going on. Now, this is actually after the Martin Luther King things that you'll be hearing about shortly. But just these racial tensions in America, and there's still a lot of race tension in America. It's a problem. Okay, but then in San Francisco, which is where I moved to, when I got done with my university, I moved to San Francisco Bay Area. In San Francisco, 1967, you had the Summer of Love. You had hippies everywhere. And hippies were like, yeah, love and freedom, and just take drugs and don't worry about anything, And they were, sexually very free and open, and it was a whole different. It was completely opposite of the culture of the 50s. A lot of the ideas of this kind of be free and spontaneous were started by the Beats generation, and then started to come into popular American culture through the hippies. And so you had hippies, and they were everywhere, and they were doing these things. And, I was there. I was born in 1962, and, no one had a clear idea of what the future was going to be like. There was a lot of talk of revolution. And there were, the Black Panthers running around. There was a group called the Weathermen who would do things like blow up tax offices. So they were, putting bombs in places. And and there was a war going on that people didn't support. It wasn't like World War II where everyone supported it. People didn't support this war. They didn't want it. And people didn't trust the government. It was, I was young, and I was 6 or 7, but I wasn't really sure that there would be an America there when I grew up. I didn't know. I thought it was all going to blow up or something. And there was just all this energy and this concept of revolution and all these hippies, and it was like this movement to be a hippie. And then there was this festival in Woodstock, and all the hippies went to this festival. It wasn't going to be such a big festival, and then it just started getting bigger and bigger. And this was in 1969. And it got to be like this huge festival. It got to be really out of control. The police couldn't control it. People were everywhere. But there was this spirit of freedom and love. And so it was people were kind to each other. They were nice. They were listening to music. They were dancing together. There really wasn't a whole lot of violence. They thought maybe 40 or 50,000 people would show up, but 400,000 people showed up, 10 times as many as they thought. And the people were, there were fences, and the fences just got knocked down because all the people just came in, and it started raining, and it was mud. People were taking drugs. They were playing in the mud and the rain and splashing around and having fun. And the governor said, "This is out of control. We need to send in the United States military." If they had sent in 10,000 army men and started shooting some of these hippies who were playing around in the mud, it just would have been so bad, and you would have gotten a lot of people who were still kind of normal people being against the government. It would have really, really blown up in a really bad way. So the decision was made, just let them party. Let them have their party. When they're done with it, they'll go home. And so they had their party. And then it got done. And all the talk of revolution, all the blowing things up, all the bombs, all the anger kind of left. It kind of left, and things started to get calm, and they started to go back to normal. The the revolution that people were talking about, which was an armed military revolution, a coup, did not happen in America. Probably because they did not send the military into Woodstock. They just let them party. And then it got done. And then it became the 1970s. The 60s were over. And people say, yeah, man, that was the 60s. I mean, it's not like the people stopped being hippies, but the talk of revolution started going down. But people really did not like the war, and the protests against the war escalated. There was a protest at a place called Kent State, a university in Ohio, and this time the military was called out, and they shot and killed 4 people. So that wasn't good. The Americans were doing what was called carpet bombing, which is just bombing everything. They weren't bombing targets. They were bombing everything in Cambodia. And people are saying, that's not like the way we do war. If we're going to attack their military, that's one thing. But when we just bomb everything, people's houses, people's farms, people's grandmothers, people's cats, everything blown up, that's not cool. So eventually the U.S. left Vietnam in 1973. Okay. So the 70s were people started going back into conservatism because the economy was starting to get there's starting to be economic problems. You had problems with the stock market losing value. It just wasn't easy to find jobs anymore. Inflation was high. Interest rates were high. People couldn't buy houses anymore. People had to really work to get houses. And they looked back at the 60s and say, oh, yeah, those were cool. We could buy a house. We had cars. We could buy a new car. We can't buy a new car. We're still driving the same car we had in the 60s. The Cold War intensified, and Russia started having nuclear weapons, and so this whole thought of nuclear war was coming up. And so that was, when I was younger, the thought of nuclear war with Russia was very real. And we were scared. We said, why? It's like, why are we even going to school when, the next week we could be blown up? It was pretty intense. People started really, the environmental movement started thinking about the environment and how to keep things clean. So that's the background, the 60s and 70s, crazy times. How did this affect our literature? We started coming into a literary form called post-realism and postmodernism. Now, modernism was really like the 1920s and 1930s. That was the modern age. And so people started saying, they started really questioning, what is real and what is the value of modernism? Because modernity was always thought of being really, really cool. And now people were starting to say, is it really that cool? Isn't this modern life causing a lot of problems? And then, what is real? What is realism? And so, this is where you started to get authors like Vonnegut, who was using this post-realism. His Vonnegut's characters and Vonnegut's situations are completely unreal. He's talking about space aliens and all this stuff, but he describes also situations that were quite real and that were really powerful. But to tell his story, he puts it in this unreal environment, which causes people to think a little bit more deeply about it. So you started to have this concept of the unreliable narrator, which is suddenly they would be writing, and then the narrator would say, yeah, but that wasn't really what happened. That was, this other thing was really happening, and that was just a dream that this person was having. And it was like, what? And so, you could never really tell what was real and what was not real in the stories. And so people would just kind of allow the stories to unfold in these very strange ways. The book, J.D. Salinger's Catch-22 came out, was a huge success, and this came up with a paradox. It also became a, like an idiom, like a catch-22. It's like if you want to get a job, you need to have experience, but how can you get experience if you can't get a job? So you need experience to get a job, but you need a job to get experience. So how do we get started? And so that's like a catch-22. I've never read that book, but it is a really popular book. Vonnegut would do these fragmented stories. I really like Vonnegut. He's a really good writer, but he writes things, and they're like 2 pages, and then he writes like 2 pages more, but they're not like directly connected. It's not like the next day, and it's not like absolutely real, but it's really good, and they fit together. And at the end of the book, Vonnegut kind of brings all these little pieces together in this really cool way that that leave you with like this amazing like realization about life. And so it's this kind of life-changing books that Vonnegut does. Really good stuff. And then, so back to science fiction, which is, of course, is my favorite. We talked about science fiction a little bit last week, but this science fiction was changing. The science fiction in the 50s was about like monsters and people going to Mars and fighting aliens and this kind of stuff. But this was a little bit more sophisticated science fiction. It started talking about social issues and, Blade Runner. Maybe you have seen this movie in 1982, but it was written in the 60s. Ursula K. Le Guin, you started having these women writers. Can't remember the Dragon Riders of Pern. Who wrote that? Anne McCaffrey. Anne McCaffrey was the name of that author. She was another female author, really popular. And so you started getting these female authors in the genre, and people were not really looking for realism anymore. So science fiction was perfect because they could kind of be realistic but in an unreal environment. And so it was really good. And this also allowed them to give important social commentaries on things that were going on, but doing it in a non-direct way, like, talking about aliens and talking about other things instead of really talking about communism. So, so that's like the 60s and 70s. And once again, I mean, this is all really short and, you may feel, oh, it's a long time, it's a 40-minute video. But yeah, it's a 3-hour class that we're doing. But the 60s and 70s were a time of great change. I mean, things changed so much. What was important in 1950 became unimportant in 1960 and important again in 1970. And parents and children couldn't speak to each other because their worlds were so different. And, things were changing really, really fast. It was really interesting times. So, anyway, I hope you got something out of the video today. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you. Next week, we have a really good presentation by Martin Luther King. Now, Martin Luther King was not really an author. He didn't write that much. I do want you to read this week, before next week, I want you to read The Letter from a Birmingham Jail. It's on Blackboard. Read chapter 15, read Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Next week you will have 2 quizzes. Quiz on chapter 14, quiz on chapter 15. And we're going to start hearing about blacks in America and what was it like to be black in America. We spent a lot of time on Native Americans, and now we're talking about black Americans. I hope you start to get this feel for America, that it's very diverse place. There's a lot of people that are different, and they're not just a little bit different. They're really, really different. Different people, different backgrounds, different cultures, coming together, living together, making one country. It's different place. America's a really different place. So, we're going to talk next week about the reality of being black in America, what that means, where what the history of it is, how that came out through the literature, and then Martin Luther King, has this speech, the I Have a Dream speech, and then I also want you to read his letter, and we'll talk about that stuff next week. Okay? There's a discussion board that I have opened on Blackboard. I want you to go into that discussion board, think about the 60s and 70s, go to a thread, make a comment, and try to make at least 3 comments. If you don't go to that board at all, I'm going to consider you as being absent for this lesson. If you go to that board and you make 1 comment, you get 50% participation. You make 2 comments, 85. You make 3 comments, and you get 100%. You can comment directly to the thread. You can make a comment to another person's comment, but make thoughtful comments and more than 1 sentence. Try to write your comments as short paragraphs, okay? And that's going to be our discussion part of it. The letter from the Birmingham jail is our reading part. This has been our lecture part, and that is going to be our online lesson for this week. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you. Seriously, I will miss you, and I'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Okay, bye. Have a great week. Bye-bye.